next week. Apparently, we can't have any gear that says Karen Read. We basically are going to have to put duct tape over our mouth.
Judge Cannoni doesn't want any outside influences or distractions. She's got to make sure the case is tried within the four walls of that courtroom.
I can tell you from my experience with this community, they are not going to be muzzled.
We were trying to figure out how we could get around that buffer zone, and everyone said we should wear a certain color. Karen Read said, I love pink, or something of that sort, and it snowballed from there.
Pink because it's Karen's favorite color. We love her.
Free Karen Read, let freedom ring! Woo!
I wanted it to be something feminine, that they wouldn't confuse it with Justice for John either and think we're pro-prosecution. Whatever, but I like it. So I just said pink.
Honestly, we had no idea going into this how many jurors we were going to be able to find that could be fair and neutral. Everyone's read the media about this. There's a lot of people who know what's going on.
How are you feeling about the jury selection?
We're very pleased. Yeah, we're happy that we have a jury, and we're looking forward to starting it.
It's just bizarre. I'm facing life in prison, and now these strangers are going to decide.
It started with a body in the snow, and a question that still refuses to go away. On a freezing January night in Massachusetts, a Boston police officer was found lifeless outside a home, his body partially buried in ice, his injuries raising more questions than answers. Just hours earlier, he had been with the woman he loved, laughing, drinking, and driving through the storm. By morning, that same woman would become the center of a case that would divide an entire nation. Was it a tragic accident fueled by alcohol and anger? Or something far more calculated, hidden behind closed doors and protected by silence? Because as investigators closed in on Karen Read, another story began to surface. One that pointed not to the street but inside the house. One that suggested the truth may have been buried long before the snow ever fell. And when the courtroom doors finally opened, what followed wasn't just a trial. It was a battle between two completely different realities. One woman, one death, two versions of the truth. And by the end of it all, the verdict would leave people asking a chilling question: did justice win, or did the truth get away? If you want the full story behind what really happened that night, the evidence, the theories, and the shocking outcome, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and stay with me till the very end. The storm had already started before they ever got in the car. Not the kind that shows up on weather radar, but the kind that builds slowly between two people who once trusted each other, now sitting in silence, carrying things neither one wanted to say out loud. It was the night of January 28th, 2022, when Karen Read and John O'Keefe had been out drinking with friends. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like a normal night. Bars, laughter, familiar faces. But those closest to them would later say something felt off. Their relationship, which had once been steady, had started to show cracks, small arguments, tension, misunderstandings that never really got resolved. And that night, as the snow began to fall harder over Canton, those cracks may have finally widened into something more serious. Sometime after midnight, the two of them left and got into Karen's SUV. The roads were already getting dangerous, visibility dropping as the storm intensified, but they weren't heading home, not yet. Instead, they made their way toward a house on Fairview Road, a house that would soon become one of the most talked about locations in modern true crime. Inside that home were other people, friends, fellow law enforcement connections, a place where, under normal circumstances, nothing unusual should have happened. But what exactly happened next? It depends entirely on who you believe. According to prosecutors, this is where everything changed. They claim that during the drive, something triggered an argument. Maybe it'd been building all night. Maybe it was something small that escalated quickly. But in that moment, inside a moving vehicle in the middle of a snowstorm, they say anger took over. Their theory is chillingly simple. Karen Read, allegedly intoxicated, pulled up outside the house, and instead of a normal drop-off, she reversed her SUV and striking John O'Keefe with enough force to leave him fatally injured in the snow. Then they say she drove away, leaving him behind, alone. In freezing temperatures that would only get worse as the hours passed. By the time anyone realized he was missing, it was already too late. Hours later, his body was discovered outside that same house, unmoving, covered in snow, his life already gone. For investigators, the case seemed to fall into place quickly. A broken taillight on Karen's vehicle, her presence at the scene. Statements she allegedly made in the aftermath, including the haunting question, "Did I hit him?" To them, it pointed in one direction. A tragic combination of alcohol, emotion, and a split-second decision that ended a life. But almost immediately, things didn't sit right. Because when people began to look closer, really look closer, the details started to blur instead of sharpen. The injuries didn't fully match what some expected from a vehicle impact. The timeline felt uncertain. And perhaps most importantly, there was that house. The same house John O'Keefe was supposed to enter. The same house where multiple people had been inside that night. And yet, no one claimed to have seen exactly what happened to him. It was as if the most critical moments of that night existed in a blind spot, just out of reach, just beyond clarity. As investigators built their case, another narrative began to quietly take shape. Not in official reports, but in whispers, conversations, and eventually public speculation. What if John O'Keefe was never struck by a vehicle at all? But what if he actually made it inside the house? What if something happened behind those doors, something that no one wanted to admit? And what if, by the time his body was found outside, the truth had already been rearranged? At first, these questions sounded like theories, the kind that often appear in high-profile cases and disappear just as quickly, but this time, they didn't go away, because the more attention the case received, the more people started to notice inconsistencies, details that didn't fully line up, gaps that raised more questions than answers. And slowly, what began as a straightforward investigation started turning into something far more complicated. For Karen Read, everything changed overnight. She went from being a girlfriend searching for answers to the primary suspect in a murder case that would soon capture national attention. Her life, her career, her reputation, everything was suddenly under a microscope. And as the charges were filed, the narrative seemed set. A woman, a vehicle, a fatal moment in the snow. But beneath that narrative, something else was growing. Doubt. The kind of doubt that doesn't fade easily. The kind that forces people to ask uncomfortable questions, because if the official story was true, then everything made sense. But if it wasn't, then it meant something far more disturbing had happened that night, something that hadn't yet been fully revealed. And as the case moved forward, those two versions of reality would begin to collide, inside a courtroom, in front of a nation watching closely. One side would argue this was a clear act, backed by evidence and logic. The other would claim it was something else entirely, a setup, a cover-up, a truth buried deeper than anyone expected. And at the center of it all was a single question that no one could answer with certainty. What really happened to John O'Keefe that night? Because the deeper this story goes, the harder it becomes to ignore the possibility that the snow didn't just cover a crime scene. It may have hidden the truth itself, By the time the case reached the courtroom, the story had already split in two, not quietly, not subtly, but in a way that forced everyone watching to pick a side, because what started as a tragic death in the snow had now turned into something far more intense, a full-scale battle over truth, power, and on what really happened in those missing hours. On one side stood the prosecution. On the other, Karen Read fighting not just for her freedom, but for her entire identity. And as the trial began, it became clear very quickly. This was not going to be a simple case. The prosecution came in with a narrative they believed was clear, logical, and supported by evidence. They walked the jury step by step through that night. The drinking, the tension in the relationship. The drive through the storm, they argued that everything led to one moment, one decision made in anger. According to them, Karen Read, impaired by alcohol and overwhelmed by emotion, backed her SUV into John O'Keefe, leaving him outside in freezing conditions with injuries he could not survive. They pointed to the broken taillight. They highlighted her alleged statements. They emphasized what they believed was a clear and tragic sequence of events. To the prosecution, this wasn't complicated. It was a case of recklessness, followed by abandonment. And for a moment, it seemed like a story that could hold, but then the defense stood up. And everything shifted. Because instead of trying to poke small holes in the prosecution's theory, they went much further. They didn't just challenge the narrative, they rejected it entirely. Their claim was bold, and for many watching, shocking. They argued that John O'Keefe was never hit by a car at all, that he had actually made it inside the house on Fairview Road, and that something happened there, something serious enough that the truth had to be hidden. But the courtroom went silent as they began laying out their version. They pointed to the injuries. Some experts suggested they didn't fully match what you'd expect from a vehicle strike. There were questions about patterns, about consistency, about whether the evidence truly aligned with the prosecution's story. Then came one of the most talked about elements of the entire case, the possibility of a dog. The defense suggested that some of the marks on O'Keefe's body could be consistent with an animal attack, raising the possibility that a dog inside the house may have been involved in whatever happened that night. It was a detail that sounded almost unbelievable at first. But in a case already filled with uncertainty, it added another layer that the jury couldn't ignore. And then came the most explosive claim of all. The defense suggested that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't just a flawed investigation. They argued that Karen Read had been framed, that people inside that house, individuals connected to law enforcement, had a reason to protect themselves, and that in doing so, they shifted the focus onto her. Suddenly, the case wasn't just about what happened in the snow, it was about what may have happened behind closed doors, about influence, about loyalty, about whether the system itself could be trusted. And just like that, the courtroom transformed into something else entirely. Not just a place of law, but a stage where two completely different realities were being presented side by side. Witnesses were called, experts debated. Each side dissected the same night, but arrived at entirely different conclusions. To some watching, the prosecution's case still made sense. To others, the defense had introduced just enough doubt to make everything feel uncertain. And outside the courtroom, something even bigger was happening. The public was becoming part of the story. People weren't just following the case, they were analyzing it, debating it, building their own theories. Podcasts began breaking down every detail. Online communities formed, each convinced they had uncovered something others had missed. Supporters of Karen Read started showing up in growing numbers. Many wore pink as a symbol of solidarity. They didn't just believe in her innocence, they believed she was the victim of something much larger. At the same time, others were deeply unsettled by that idea. To them, the defense's claims felt like an attempt to distract from what they saw as a straightforward case. The divide became impossible to ignore, and as the trial continued, one thing became clear. This case was no longer just about evidence. It was about perception, because depending on which details you focused on, the entire story could change. And that's what made it so powerful and so dangerous, because in a case where both sides presented compelling arguments, where evidence could be interpreted in more than one way, where doubt existed but certainty did not, the outcome would come down to something incredibly fragile: belief. What the jury believed happened that night. What they believed the evidence truly showed. What they believed was reasonable and what wasn't. As the arguments came to an end and the courtroom fell into a tense silence, everyone knew what was coming next. The decision that would define everything, but what no one could predict was just how complicated that decision would become. Because when the jury finally stepped away to deliberate, they weren't just deciding between guilt and innocence. They were choosing between two completely different versions of reality. And in a case like this, that's where everything starts to fall apart. The decision didn't come quickly. For days, the jury sat behind closed doors, going over every detail, every argument, every contradiction that had been laid out in front of them. 12 people, each carrying the weight of a case that had already divided an entire country. Because this wasn't just about evidence anymore, and it was about which version of the truth they believed. Inside that room, they had to answer a question that no one outside could answer with certainty. What really happened to John O'Keefe on that freezing night? The prosecution had given them a clear path, simple, direct, and grounded in what they believed was physical evidence. A vehicle, an impact, a decision made in anger. But the defense had given them something else entirely: doubt, and not just small, technical doubt, but a kind of doubt that reshaped the entire story. A possibility that everything people thought they knew about that night could be wrong. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the tension was almost unbearable. Every eye was fixed forward. No one moved. No one spoke. And then the words came. Not guilty. The charge that had defined the entire case, second-degree murder, was gone in an instant. Then came the next. Not guilty. Vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated, also gone. And then another. Not guilty. Leaving the scene of a fatal collision, rejected. One by one, the pillars of the prosecution's case collapsed. But not everything. There was one charge that remained, operating under the influence, a conviction, but one that carried a very different weight. Instead of prison, probation. And just like that, after years of investigation, months of build-up and days of intense deliberation, Karen Read walked out of that courtroom a free woman. Outside, the reaction was immediate. Cheers erupted. A crowd that had gathered for hours, many dressed in pink, broke into celebration. Voices echoed through the air, chants and applause, emotion spilling out all at once. Some waved flags, some cried, some simply stood there trying to process what they had just witnessed. When Karen Read stepped outside, she was met with overwhelming support. She embraced her legal team, her family, and those who had believed in her from the very beginning. In that moment, for her supporters, it felt like justice had finally been served, but not everyone saw it that way, because while one side was celebrating, the other side was left with something very different. Silence. The family of John O'Keefe left the courtroom without comment. No statements, no reactions, just the quiet weight of a loss that no verdict could undo. And soon after, voices began to rise again, but this time not in celebration. Some witnesses and observers called the outcome a devastating miscarriage of justice. They argued that the truth had been overshadowed by speculation, by theories, by a narrative that had grown beyond the evidence itself. They believed the wrong conclusion had been reached, and just like that, the divide remained, even after the verdict, even after the case was technically over. Because this wasn't the kind of story that ends cleanly. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense, no single explanation that everyone could agree on. Instead, what remained was something far more unsettling. Two realities, still existing side by side. In one, Karen Read was a woman wrongly accused, caught in a situation she didn't create, forced to fight against a system that failed her. In the other, a justice had slipped through the cracks, lost in confusion, doubt, and competing narratives, and somewhere in between those two versions was the truth, still out there, still unanswered. Because despite everything, the trials, the arguments, the verdict, one question has never truly gone away. What actually happened that night? Did the snow-covered street hold all the answers, or did the real story begin behind the door of that house? And if the truth was never fully uncovered, then what does that say about the system meant to find it? This case didn't just leave behind a verdict, it left behind a conversation, one that continues to grow, to divide, and to challenge what people believe about justice itself. And maybe that's why it still grips so many people, because deep down, everyone is asking the same thing. If this could happen here, could it happen anywhere? If you made it this far, then you already know this isn't just another case. It's a story that forces you to think, to question, and to decide for yourself what you believe. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think justice was truly served? Or do you believe something was missed? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective matters more than you think. And if you want more real stories like this, stories that go beyond headlines and dive into the details that others overlook, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next.